You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
All right, today is October 22nd, 2019. I'm Peter Boettke. I am the University Professor of Economics and Philosophy at George Mason University and the Director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center. And today I'm here with my guest, Professor Richard Ebeling. Richard is the BB&T Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Free Enterprise Leadership at the Citadel in South Carolina. Prior to that, Professor Ebeling was a professor at Northwood University. He was president of the Foundation for Economic Education. He was a Ludwig von Mises Professor at Hillsdale College and also a professor at the University of Dallas. Professor Ebeling was also a professor at Rutgers in the Austrian economics program, which was the precursor for the Center for Study of Market Processes at George Mason, which eventually became Mercatus. So Richard has known and taught many of the key figures, including not only Israel Kirzner, Ludwig Lochmann, and Murray Rothbard, but also the Austrians, such as Machlup and Habler, and also the younger generation, such as Tyler Cowen and Dan Klein, but also Peter Leeson, Ryan Opria, Robert Murphy, etc. And I'm going to start by trying to get Richard to talk about how he got involved in Austrian economics and the various different, the time period and what it was like to be a young Austrian in the 1970s, and then the various exciting initiatives that took place during that time by various academic entrepreneurs, but then also the shock of Hayek winning the Nobel Prize and all that. So first, welcome
Thank you.
Here, Richard, and let's begin. So how did you get all involved in these ideas?
Actually, I got interested in these ideas when I was in high school. How do you explain why you get interested in something? But I was in junior high school and actually high school particularly, and I was interested in history and political current events and that type of thing. And I had a part-time job after my high school hours at the Hollywood Public Library. I grew up in Hollywood, California. John Ritter of Three's Company was my student body president, for those who remember that old sitcom. Yeah. His father was Tex Ritter. Anyway, so I had this part-time job, and it was a grand old-fashioned Art Deco building, which has since burned down. But my primary job was I was in the balcony taking care of the magazine collections. You know, new issues come in, you have to put them away. Issues are asked for, you have to return them. And so I would do my work. I was there 4 hours a day, and I would do my work in 2 hours, and then hide in the balcony and just read. And then one day I had been at a used bookstore along Hollywood Boulevard, and on my way home I stopped at a restaurant that no longer exists at the corner of Hollywood and Vine called Hodie's Restaurant. And I sat down on a stool at the counter between two guys. And I later found out this was their routine. They would leave a stool open between them because they were the spiders attracting flies. Uh-huh. And so I opened one of the books I had bought, and I still remember it. It was a collection of essays on totalitarianism edited by a once well-known political scientist named Carl Friedrich. And one of these gentlemen asked me, well, what's that about? And draws me into this conversation. And I say, blah, 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 blah. And he says, have you ever heard of Ayn Rand? And they said, well, this is a political philosopher. She writes about these things. And one of them whips out a paperback copy of her nonfiction essays, Capitalism and the Unknown Ideal. And they say, we want you to read this and come back in 3 days. And this is all the true story, Pete. So I go home and read this, and this is wonderful. So I come back in 3 days, and we chat for about an hour, and then they hand me a paperback copy of her other collection, The Virtue of Selfishness. And I go home and read this because they said, come back in 3 days. And now this is wonderful. Man has inherent rights, the collective doesn't have a claim on my fruits of my labor. And so I come back and we talk about this one, and they said, well, we think it's time for you to read her novels. One of them whips out a paperback copy of Atlas Shrugged. My heart sinks. I know they're going to say 3 days. And they say, read this and come back in 10 days. I wiped the sweat from my brow.
Yeah.
But I read the book, and I will confess I read John Galt's speech 3 times. And then they said, when I came back to talk with them, you can attend tape lectures about her philosophy. This was at the old Nathaniel Branden Institute. And so I started attending tape lectures with them. And there would be a break in the middle of the evening, get coffee, visit the restroom. But there was also a bookshelf full of books that she recommended. And what was there? Well, Ludwig von Mises, Bombaverick, Henry Hazlitt, Karl Menger, a variety of others, Albert J. Nock, and Herbert Spencer, and so forth. And I started reading this, and I became fascinated. First, because it was like the economic bolstering of the philosophy of individualism. But now I just got interested in what they were saying, economics, qua economics. And I then found out that there was this magazine called The Freeman. And remember, this was the era of snail mail. This is like in the 1960s. So I started corresponding with Bettina Bien-Graves, who was one of their senior staff members and knowledgeable about all things Mises. And she started sending me and feeding me all these articles. That's how I found out about Hayek, The Road to Serfdom. So that by the time I finished high school, I knew, I wanted to go to college. I wanted to major in economics. And these were the ideas that I cared about. So I start college, and my first semester, freshman year, I can sign up for an economics class. And I have this rude awakening because I'm assigned a textbook, Paul Samuelson's 7th edition. And I realized that this is in economics different than the stuff I've been reading on my own. And to make a long story short, because time is a scarce resource, I suppose, I ended up finishing my bachelor's degree at California State University in Sacramento, where all my professors were old-fashioned textbook Keynesians or Stalinist Marxists. And notice how I say that. I just don't mean Marxists. These two professors believed that the world had become a sadder place since Comrade Stalin had died. And the only two countries to look to for guidance and hope for a future was Mao's China and Albania. Now, so I'm attending all these classes, and I've been reading on my own. And I got frustrated because the other students are just, absorbing this. So this intensified me, where I would go to the library and just find old books and the journal articles. And then I would, let's put it the way, I would attempt to discuss in the classroom. Not that I knew, about 18, 19 years old. I'm not going to influence or change the professor's view, but I wanted the other students to know that there were other views. But that ended up honing my skills about realizing the kind of arguments that I could be presented by mainstream economics. So that made me want to learn mainstream economics even more, so that I could understand why they held these views and the logic behind them, if in fact the other views, the quote Austrian views that I had been reading on my own, had validity and had a response to their criticisms. And so so as a result, this is the environment. Now it was a very anti-Austrian environment because when Mises died in 1973, I wrote a little obituary piece for the college newspaper. And one of my professors came up, and he wasn't joking. He said, Mises, didn't he die in the 19th century? And then when Hayek won the Nobel Prize, I put on a bulletin board of like a coffee room that econ students and the professor shared, a big notice, Hayek Nobel Prize winner announced today. And my professor, who's this Hayek guy? What has he ever done in economics deserve? Oh, yeah, he wrote that diatribe called The Road to Serfdom. Wasn't he the economist scratching their head who talked about full employment during the Great Depression? So that was the environment I was in. The library there had an excellent collection in that they had the bound volumes of all the economics journals virtually back to the first issues of the late 19th century. So I started plowing through this. Yeah. And I suddenly realized that there wasn't just Austrian economics, which I tried to find as many of those pieces as possible. But there was this vast body of economics knowledge before Keynes and before Paul Samuelson that was fascinating, brilliant, insightful, and rich with understanding. And so I just was absorbing this. Now, in the midst of this, I had the opportunity through some mutual friends to be introduced to Floyd Harper, the founder of the Institute for Humane Studies, IHS, which was then headquartered in Menlo Park, California. Baldy unfortunately passed away, and other people were then serving as the caretakers to maintain IHS, and they remembered me. So in the early part of 1974, I get this invitation in the mail. Remember, I'm an undergraduate, to attend this Austrian economics conference in South Royalton, Vermont. And they paid my way, enough to go across country from California to Vermont by Greyhound bus. All I'd done is read these people, right? I'd never met any of them. So you have images in your mind about what people look like, their personas. So from just reading, for example, Murray Rothbard, I had this, Man, Economy, and State, America's Great Depression. I had this conception of him as tall, thin, and very serious. My astoundment when I show up and there's this short, roly-poly guy who keeps laughing, cackling, and telling funny stories. But I had a chance that was my first introduction to Ludwig Lockman, to Israel Kirzner. Henry Hazlitt attended it. There was a dinner. Milton Friedman came to one of the dinners because he had a home in Vermont, and he had been invited to one of the main dinners. And it was the lectures were delivered by Kirzner, Lockman, and Rothbard. It became a volume called the Foundations of Modern Austrian Economics, edited by Edwin Dolan. And among the participants there were, in retrospect, now you realize they were in graduate school. I think one or two, like myself, were still undergraduates, but very interested in these ideas, who now, in retrospect, realize became an entire generation of helping to revive the Austrian school. Mm-hmm. Karen Vaughan was there. Jack High was there. Mario Rizzo was there. Gerald O'Driscoll was there. Suda Shinoy was there. Who else was there? I'm blanking out, but all the potpourri of these, Roger Garrison, and then they're just young people interested in those ideas. Well, fast forward like almost a half a century later, and now looking back, they were the major forces for a reawakening of the mm-hmm. Austrian tradition. And so there, you met people you had never met before, and these became close-knit relationships. And so after that conference, which was fascinating and would itself be a whole series of amusing stories, so then the next year, and I'm still an undergraduate, I get this invitation to be a summer fellow for IHS in Menlo Park, and which I repeated in 1977. And again, the usual suspects were all there, many of whom I mentioned from South Royalton. But both of those summers, also in residence, was Friedrich Hayek. Now, of course, in 75, he had now won the Nobel Prize. And by lucky chance, both summers, his office was only one or two doors down from mine. And here I am in my mid-20s, and at that time, he was around 76, 77 years old. So to me, this seems like an ancient guy. And I'm thinking to myself, 77 years old, he could die in his sleep. Well, he's gone. So I took the attitude, I have to go into his office and drain everything out of his mind about Austrian economics. So being in a real pest, an interested young person, every time he was in the office, which is very frequently, I would try to go in for an hour or two and just pick his mind. And he was, if one could have an epitome of what you think a Nobel Prize winner should be, knowledgeable, worldly wise, patient, willing to share his knowledge with you, deferential to listening to what you had to say, that was Hayek in a persona. But I should also mention is that his doctor had insisted that he give up smoking. He had been an avid pipe smoker for, I guess, decades. But he had a nicotine need. So he started sniffing snuff. So he would sit there talking to you, sniffing the snuff, and the little shreds just start dribbling down on his mustache, on his tie, and you couldn't concentrate on what he was saying because you're wondering, where's it going to fall next? But
it's one of the funny scenes in his interview with Alchin in the oral histories is that he stops in the middle and he puts some snuff on his thing,
exactly,
and then sniffs it. And when you're first watching it, especially this generation isn't used to it, you think, did Hayek just snort cocaine? Did he just do that on film? But no, it's a snuff thing. Yeah.
So, but those are great experiences to get to know Hayek. I mean, anyone who had that opportunity of my generation certainly can say that they met in the flesh one of the great intellectual figures of the 20th century.
Yeah, no, it's amazing.
I should say one other thing about him is that, after having been at the pinnacle of international attention in the 1930s, and in fact, those studies that say, who's been the most cited economist in this time and that time, in the 1930s, he was the third most cited economist in the English language journals in the world, right after John Maynard Keynes and Dennis Robertson. And you look through that type of list in the post-World War II period, he's gone down an Orwellian memory hole. He said at one time in some interview that when Keynes passed away in 1946, he said to his wife, "I guess that makes me the most famous economist in the world." And from that to intellectual oblivion. But in spite of that, you would talk to him in these conversations like I did, and he was amusingly self-deprecating. He would say, well, let me share you one more story about one of my other famous defeats in a conversation with Arthur Pagoo and things like that. People who knew him say that he went through several depressions in the 1950s and 60s, but maybe the Nobel Prize really changed him, but he certainly didn't demonstrate that at all. He could look backwards and see amusement in it all, but now from the perspective of a revival of an interest in him and his ideas.
I wanted to focus today on the conversations having to do with Mises and his papers, of which you were a part. So first, I would like it if you could give some background to Mises' fundamental contributions and his relevance in his time.
Okay. Well, just the sort of basic biography stuff. He was born in September 1881 in the eastern reaches of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, region or Galatia. He came from a very prominent Orthodox Jewish family. In fact, it was his great-grandfather who was ennobled with the title von, Ludwig von Mises, just a few months before he was born. In fact, if you look through his ennoblement papers, that is his great-grandfather's ennoblement papers, in the Austrian Vienna archives, his great-grandfather had to prepare a family tree, and there's all the people for several generations, but no Ludwig. And why is there no baby Ludwig? Because Ludwig hasn't shown up in the world for about another 3 or 4 months. And in fact, the family was prominent, not only in the Jewish community in the narrow sense, but they were supporters of liberal Enlightenment policies throughout the 19th century. There's a Polish sort of intellectual biography of famous Poles in the geographical sense of Poland. And if you look up the citation on his great-great-grandfather, they were active in the liberal causes of the revolutions of 1848.
Oh.
And so he was ennobled, as relative of his great-great-grandfather, because of his service to the Orthodox Jewish community and the general community Enlightenment activities, and therefore the Emperor Franz Joseph was recognizing this contribution with the ennoblement, and that's how he became von. His father was a railway engineer, trained in Switzerland, but like many Jews who had joined the sort of Enlightenment reform culture, his father decided to move to Vienna and leave the traditional family home to pursue his career in Vienna. So the family moved there in the early 1890s. Mises obviously was a small boy, but he ended up going to the academic gymnasium. This was an academic-oriented high school that was meant to consciously be a stepping stone for those students who were planning to go on to university. He had a very thorough education in the classics, of course, but his first language, foreign language, was French, and his second language was English. And in this setting, he he would have become well versed in the natural sciences, in the ancient Greeks. He knew ancient Greek. He knew Latin. He knew a working knowledge of Italian, uh, and he could understand several of the Slavic languages. That became clear from the lost papers that we'll end up talking about. So, to make a long story short, because I'm sort of focusing perhaps too much on that family relationship, he ended up going to the University of Vienna. He earned a law degree with a focus on economics, which is how the system works. So he was both a lawyer and an economist. But academic positions are few and far between. So he ended up having to go to work with the Vienna Chamber of Commerce, a position that he took up in 1909, and which he held until 1934, except for the war years. He served. He was called up. Had been in the reserves, a lieutenant in the reserves, Austrian Army. Was called up to active duty with an artillery unit. Saw action during most of that time on the Eastern Front, fighting the Imperial Russian armies in the Carpathian Mountains and in what now we would consider part of Ukraine, and was 3 times decorated for bravery under fire in leading his men to capture Russian military batteries and armament wagons.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
Two things: one, culture, and one, scientific.
Yes.
Recently, about 2 or 3 years ago, I read Stephen Zweig's the World of Yesterday,
Yes.
which is about this same period
Yes.
in Vienna. It's related to when I was doing research on a book on Hayek, and I came across a new book about the Vienna Circle, and it was called The Quest for Exact Thinking in Demented Times.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a fascinating kind of idea. So then I started figuring out what actually, how did these guys all see dementedness of the times? And the Zweig book did a really great capture of the glory of Vienna,
Yes.
Findersicle Vienna, and then the decline that happens, in the 30s and all the stuff after that. But in your own experience of trying to recapture this intellectual culture or whatever, do you have any good recommended books for people about Vienna and the wonderment of Vienna, and then the frustration with the tearing apart of that civilization?
Well, actually, there's a whole series of books that have been published over the last 25 or 30 years, maybe even earlier than that, on Vienna at the turn of the century. To be quite frank, there's like so many of them, I'm blanking out on the titles, but there are some fairly good ones. None that particularly focus on economics. It's sort of the culture, the society, the politics, the decline and decadence of the society. To give one example of this, but in a different context, the founder of the Austrian school, Karl Menger, had been the tutor to the heir apparent, Rudolf, who ended up committing suicide. But during the years when they were associated together, they published, quote, an anonymous monograph on the Austrian aristocracy and its decadence, that they had lost their place in society pursuing pleasures and wasteful activities, and that therefore their day had passed and it was time for a middle-class bourgeoisie that would represent a new modern and enlightened ethic for the society. And that I think sort of captured. It's often said that I believe with some exaggeration, that the intellectuals who understood the world they were living in at that time were always depressed, pessimistic. They point to the number of suicides. Well, of course, if you really add up the suicides, it's a fraction. But if they're people who seem prominent, or even if you're alive and you've known them, it impacts you. But I believe there was always a sense that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was sort of an anomaly. Mm-hmm. It represented an institution and a social order of the past, that the world had been moving into a different era. And there was often the comment by foreign observers that the only thing that held the empire together politically, culturally, socially, was the emperor, Franz Josef. He had taken power in 1848, and he only passed away in 1916, in the middle of the First World War. It's an immensely long reign, over half a century. So for many people, he was
Austro-Hungarian.
They were the Austria of them culturally, a sense of a figure. And so they always felt that they were at end of times, because how long could this guy rule with his symbolic glue holding the society together? And when he eventually passed, there was nationalist uprisings and sentiments. There was political chaos. The minority groups in the Austrian parliament would often go into filibusters. And so the emperor would have to give the prime minister extraordinary executive authorities to just rule by not dictatorial decree, but things have to be operating on a day-to-day basis. You don't need parliament's approval for everything every day. There was a sense of the rise of socialist sentiments. The Social Democratic Party was very active in Vienna in particular, beginning in the 1890s. And at the same time, the city government was controlled by the Christian socials, who were called by some as the advocates of the socialism of fools, because they were highly anti-Semitic. So you had radical socialists, you had anti-Semitic socialists of a sort of a cultural conservative bent. You have this rising nationalism nationwide, threatening to split the country, and you just feel that Austria is like out of sync with all these, either for good or bad, modern trends. Yeah. And that was the environment in which these people lived. Yeah. Mises comments in some of the essays in passing before the First World War that what needs to be preserved and enhanced is the Austrian idea. Now, the Austrian idea, which was common among some intellectuals at the time, is that if people could feel that they shared a common culture and a common future, even though they had national and linguistic difference, Austria-Hungary could be sort of what Lord Acton was hoping for in his famous essay on nationality in the 1860s, 1867, in which he says, well, people have their own senses of national identity, ethnicity, linguistic commonality. The best state is a multicultural state. The reason being is that those groups that have culturally moved further ahead can uplift the others that are further behind. And yet at the same time, that diversity makes those who are culturally more advanced realize that they need to be tolerant, that they aren't the only ones. And so that in fact enriches the society by a multiculturalism of a society. And the advocates of this Austrian idea were great proponents of that. This is a theme developed by an excellent historian who was considered in the middle decades of the 20th century as one of the major authorities on nationalism, Hans Kuhn. He in fact was a German Jew who grew up in Prague in those early, in the 1890s and beginning of the century. And he in several of his works, he explains to you and helps you understand this idea of this lost hope of an Austrian idea.
So switching from the culture, I mean, that's fascinating. I don't usually quote Marx, but one of the things that I really like, a phrase of Marx was, when he describes these transitions sometimes, he says, all that's solid melts into air.
Yes.
And when you're reading the Viennese intellectuals, Toulmin's book on Wittgenstein's Vienna or anything like that, you get this sense that all that was solid melts into air, and there is a kind of demented times, but that sometimes necessity is the mother of invention. And so this tremendous burst of intellectual creativity that's going on in all these different fields happens to be going on at this time as well.
I'll just mention one more thing, is that you mentioned Stefan Zweig's book, The World of Yesterday, which came out in 1942. He and his wife were Austrian Jews who went into exile and ended up in Brazil, where he wrote or finished that manuscript, and it was published just before they committed suicide themselves. Since we've been talking about that, but he at one point, and I know since you've read the book you might remember this, he presents this nostalgia that in spite of all of the conflicts, there was the sense in the Vienna society that you came together and you shared and you conversed and you had a commonality in the coffee houses, and there was a sense of respect and tolerance in spite of all this. I think that in one sense that's a nostalgia for something that wasn't true, because you always understand things after the fact, not when you're living through it. And the fact that that the Austro-Hungarian Empire could implode like this, and the national, political and economic nationalism could rise so viciously to the society once the empire disintegrated. The national and ethnic and linguistic animosities that immediately took hold in almost all of the successor states shows that in fact it had always been a volcano that had sort of like a cork on top of it holding it. When the cork was removed, which was the death of Franz Josef in the midst of the war, it all exploded.
Yeah, I was reminded of this only because his description of the gymnasiums, and the way that the students, and then also there's a book about Karl Polanyi has kind of had a resurrection in economic sociology and moral political economy circles, and his brother Michael. The one that we like better. Michael, there's also a new book about him and his scientific community, and they also go back to this gymnasium, the way you were describing how these elite students, basically were exposed to amazing things in terms of the ability to learn languages and whatnot. Anyway, I want one other question just about this background, which is I was just wondering if you could take like just a few minutes to update, modern listeners about the contribution and the breadth of respect throughout the world that Bombavrik held at the time that Mises was his student.
Well, yes. Now, Eugen von Bombavrik was born in 1851. He died in 1914. Just shortly after the beginning of the First World War, he had a heart attack. He and a fellow student, Friedrich von Wieser, discovered Menger's principles shortly after it was published, although they did not have a chance to study with Menger at the University of Vienna. But what they did do is they went to the University of Heidelberg for their graduate studies, and they ended up inspired by his book to start taking themes that they would sort of elaborate and extend, and that's sort of how they became famous for those ideas. So Bombavrik, on the one hand, established, really he and Wieser, but particularly him, established the international reputation of an Austrian school, far more than Menger. Because you see, while Menger's books were not, his principles were not published into English until 1950, Bombavrik and Wieser had their books published in English in the 1890s. So the world became knowledgeable about the Austrian school through their works, not through Menger's. And Bombavrik was a great both polemicist and a controversial debater. First of all, he had an encyclopedic knowledge of the history of economic thought. At the same time, anyone who would write anything critical of his essays or books, he viewed that as a challenge and would write responses and rebuttals. The most famous ones probably being the exchange between him and the famous American economist John Bates Clark, who's known for his distribution of wealth book as a developer of the marginal productivity theory. Well, they went back and forth at least two, maybe three exchanges on these issues of interest and the nature of capital. So Bombavrik had this international reputation as this voice for, quote, the Austrian perspective that put it on the map, if you will. Then, you see, he actually lived two lives. He had gotten his teaching position at the University of Innsbruck, but not long after he published his Capital Interest, which is his history of capital interest, and then his own version, The Positive Theory of Capital, he got called to public service, which is what he did for most of his professional life after that. He was called to Vienna to work in the Ministry of Finance, in senior positions, both administrator and responsible for fiscal and tax matters. He 3 times served as the Minister of Finance of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the longest period being 1900 to 1904. And at this time, if you look at that period, the budget was balanced, taxes were cut, spending was cut, so there was surpluses for so the part of the debt was being paid off, and there was no further, there was minimal additional government regulation. He operated on He operated in a cabinet by a prime minister who, as one historian put it, was a proto-Keynesian. He wanted to the prime minister wanted to stimulate the Austrian economy through public works projects, right? Demand, employment, and at cabinet meetings where the emperor was present, Bombavrik, as this historian calls him, was the stumbling block, arguing against his own prime minister, as well as trying to tactfully explain to the emperor why his views and understandings of fiscal matters perhaps could need a little improvement. So actually, so Bombavrik was sort of the anti-Keynesian in a proto-Keynesian, the government of a proto-Keynesian prime minister, and then he left the ministry in 1904 because he couldn't stand the corruption anymore that he saw in all the ministries, the slush funds, favoritism, contracts, and so he resigned. And he then went back to his teaching position, but now at the University of Vienna, where he taught for the next 10 years in a famous seminar of his, where you had people like Ludwig von Mises and Joseph Schumpeter and many others.
So that's, I mean, that's it's just I think it's important for people to realize how internationally recognized Bombavrik was as an economist, both in the world of science and in the world of politics.
Right.
Okay, so that's the background. Mises is a student of Bombavrik.
Yes.
He Schumpeter as well as a student of Bombavrik.
Yes.
So you have two major figures that come out of this.
Yes, who don't get along personally.
Right, and then but then Mises goes off and starts his own career, and he develops his own scientific reputation. Maybe if you could just talk about his development as an economist, theorist, and then his role at the chamber from the theory of money and credit forward a little bit. Just a few minutes.
Yeah. Well, now his first book comes out in 1912. Well, it's not actually his first book. He did some monographs before that on economic history issues. But his first major book comes out in 1912, which is a book on the theory of money and credit, in which he develops the theory of the demand for money, sort of a micro foundations to the demand for money. He adopts a certain strand of 19th century economic thought that runs especially through the British economist John E. Cairns on emphasizing the non-neutrality of money, the micro rippling sequence of an injection of money enters and passes in sequence, a sequential time process affecting relative prices, relative wages, the structures of profitability, and then takes that and blends it with two other traditions. Bombavrik's theory of capital is a time structure of production. And then Wicksel's, the Swedish economist, the Swedish economist Knut Wicksell, who had published Prices and Interest in 1898, on the difference between a natural rate of interest, at which that's a rate of interest that assures an equilibrium between real savings and real investment, and a money rate of interest that can easily be distorted through monetary policy to push it below the natural rate and create an imbalance between savings and investment. The consequence of it is that he lays out this theory of money, money's dynamic nature, and the interactive impact of misguided monetary policy that distorts interest rates from their equilibrium levels to bring about investment booms inconsistent with real savings that's going to set the stage for an economic downturn at some point. And that's his major contribution before the First World War, which gets recognition, but especially recognition after the First World War. But then he goes off and serves, as I said, in the Austrian army during the war. He comes back to the Chamber of Commerce and other duties. But in the midst of this, he is also writing essays, one of which becomes his famous essay, Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, which is printed obviously in German in 1920, in which he's challenging this new sense that socialism is the wave of the future. There's been the Bolshevik Revolution. There has been an uprising of a short Soviet republic in Bavaria. There has been in existence an attempted Marxist government in Hungary next door, and the Social Democrats and the Communists in Austria are themselves all sort of panting with excitement to do this. So in the midst of this, he writes this famous article in which he basically challenges the socialists on a mundane yet profoundly important question. Let us suppose you've nationalized the means of production, and you've now established a system of central planning, which all of you, socialists and Marxists, say that you want. How now do you effectively plan an economy better than and more efficiently than a competitive market economy? In a nutshell, in a market economy, there are market prices, reflecting the valuations and appraisements of both consumers and rivalrous producers for hiring the means of production. These prices provide the scalars by which you can compare the value of the outputs with the value of the inputs and the relative costs of different combinations of the inputs. So is this profitable or is this loss-making? And if there is one that's profitable, how can I combine the technological means of production in minimal value cost ways to maximize my potential profits if my entrepreneurial judgment turns out to be correct? Mm-hmm. And Mises says, well, after you've nationalized the means of production, there's nothing legally left to buy and sell. With nothing to buy and sell, there's no higgling in the marketplace. With no higgling in the marketplace, there's no agreed upon terms of trade. If there's no agreed upon terms of trade, then there's no prices. And if there's no prices, how do you rationally guide and direct the use of the resources to both get the most that you can in value terms out of what you have, and they have been directed in ways that are satisfying the most urgently desired wants of the consumers themselves. You can't do it. Yeah. So as Mises explained in the title of a little book of his many years later, you do not have a rational economy superior to any capitalist one. You have planned chaos. Right. Now, of course, this causes a firestorm of controversy, but it doesn't change the fact that by the end of the day now, in the 1920s, the 1930s, into the 1940s, Mises basically has challenged all of them, where in a sense their fallback defense position is that of Oskar Lange in the 1930s, the famous Polish economist, who says, well, yeah, Mises is right, we need prices. We can beat a statue of him in front of the planning department, but we can play at prices. The Central Planning Agency will set up sort of parameter prices. The state factory managers will use those to decide how best to utilize resources and what to produce. And if these prices do not represent correct prices, well, the Central Planning Agencies will adjust them to try to move the system back a more coordinated direction over time. The problem, Mises says, and I'm focusing on Mises because Friedrich Hayek, his young colleague, obviously had his own very detailed rebuttals of this, but Mises' response is this: there are they're either play prices or real prices, and you don't know what things are worth in a changing and fluctuating world on a day-to-day basis unless they reflect, again, the values and appraisements of those who are actually demanding goods they're interested in paying for, and those who are investing with their own capital, and therefore they have an interest to be deciding what they think these resources are worth and the best way to apply them, as opposed to some abstract central planning committee in the capital of the future socialist state doing this in some depersonalized and non-personalized way.
Yeah, so I think that's a good setup because so we have Mises, the major economic scientist who's contributed to monetary theory and is recognized throughout the continent as a major of that, and then he is the person who puts forth the challenge to the socialist comparative economic systems, right. Using standard price theory at that time was understood. This is what he's emphasizing. And he's also the leading liberal, one of the leading liberal thinkers throughout Europe.
Yes, and in this thing, he takes that article of 1920, and maybe a good number of the listeners may know this, he then expands it into a full-blown treatise, which in English is just called Socialism and Economic and Sociological Analysis, which in its first German edition comes out in 1922. But this critique of socialism as an economic system is the core central chapters, but it's enveloped in a critique of socialism as a political ideal, as a cultural possibility, as an international order. its relationship to secular beliefs and religious faiths, the place of women in a socialist order compared to a liberal one. So while the focus on socialism, if you read it carefully, he's always juxtaposing, well, in the liberal society, in the liberal system. So he's always judging the socialists by the benchmark, both it's as what he views as right thinking on economics, but from the setting of a political economic order of liberalism of a classical type, which then, of course, he then separates and expounds upon independently in a 1927 book on liberalism, which is his restatement of the liberal ideal. Then followed 2 years later in 1929 by a collection of essays called Critique of Interventionism, in which he's saying it's not as if you reject socialism, but you really don't want laissez-faire liberalism. What about the mixed economy, a third way? And his system is that there is no possibility of a third way, that interventionism is not as radically disruptive as the abolition of markets and prices, but you're not allowing prices to work, and therefore it's like sand in the machine, distorting the coordinating and informational role of the prices. And he talks about a division of knowledge in prices in these settings. And at the same time, by setting up production restrictions, you are preventing the entrepreneur from, as effectively of his knowledge and own self-interest would suggest, to be guiding production in ways most servicing the consumers. So at the end of the day, neither socialism nor interventionism are, in the long run, workable substitutes for a functioning and fairly free competitive market economy.
Yeah, and I think it's in. I mean, that's a great summary, and I think that the what I wanted to sort of set you up to get to the lost papers now was that Mises's stature in the international community and in the German-speaking world in particular, as a scientist and as a representative of liberalism. And so now he, you've discussed in several places, he moves to Geneva, but his papers and everything are still back in Vienna. And so tell the story then from there about what happens to his library, to his papers, and the subsequent history of that and your own discovery of those.
Okay, well, Mises had worked, as I said, at the Vienna Chamber of Commerce from 1909 to 1934, minus his war years activities. And he had been a Privatdozent at the university, an unsalaried lecturer, a very popular teacher there, not just with, in the nationality sense, Austrian students who were attending the university, but many foreign students came and studied for a semester with him. And his registration cards, which are among his lost papers, shows many of them who you sort of vaguely know from earlier periods of the 20th century. But he gets this offer to have for a one-year position at the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. And he takes a leave of absence from the Chamber of Commerce. In retrospect, his contracts were renewed until 1940, when he chose to resign to move to the United States. But as a consequence, he leaves most of his stuff in Vienna. I mean, you have to have, obviously, if any, a professor or a writer, you need to have some books, some papers. So obviously he took some materials with him to Geneva, but the bulk of his papers, his library, his manuscripts, correspondence are all in his apartment. Now, Mises was a bachelor all this time. So, he kept everything in his mother's apartment. But his mother passed away in late 1937. He returned the apartment to the landlord, but he happened to know the couple who then began renting the apartment that he had been living in. And in that context, he sublet what had been his room in the apartment from them. So he didn't have to do something with all of his stuff.
Right.
And the family stuff that he had moved into that room with his mother's passing. Now, a few months later, it's March of 1938, the Anschluss occurs, that is the German invasion, and shortly after that, formal annexation of Austria into the Third Reich, Nazi Germany. But within the first couple of weeks after the Nazi occupation of Austria, the Gestapo came to his apartment looking for him. Well, he's safe in Geneva, Switzerland. But they break into the room that he'd been continuing to sublet in what had been his mother's apartment, and they just box up everything. His papers, his library, his correspondence, his personal effects, and they're gone. Now, about a year later, in March of 1939, he sent a letter of information to all of his friends throughout Europe. I only found out about this letter to begin with because I found them among Hayek's papers at the Hoover Institution. But it's like a 2 or 3 page letter, and he explains what had happened. And he actually enumerates some of the collections of books that they had taken away, and the type of papers and correspondence and other things. And he says that he had had a lawyer intercede on his behalf with the German authorities, basically the Gestapo, and trying to get at least some of his belongings back. And according to the lawyer, the Gestapo said, we don't know where they are. Now, I knew his widow, Margit von Mises, fairly well in New York in the 1970s. And I asked her, what did Mises think about all this? And she said that he believed to the day he died that either the Nazis had destroyed everything, which would not have been unusual, that imagery of the Germans burning books and stuff, or perhaps it had been in a warehouse, Allied bombing and,
Right.
the fate of war. Who knows? But as I like to say, remembering a song from the Gershwin, Porgy and Bess opera, it ain't necessarily so.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, it turns out that Mises's papers ended up being put in a repository in a small town in Bohemia, what is now the Czech Republic, along with all of these other collections that the Nazis plundered as they overran good parts of Europe. As I had been mentioning to you earlier, handwritten Mozart scores, manuscripts by Einstein in hand, things such as the entire secret police archive of the French police that the Nazis had looted when they occupied Paris in 1940. So it goes on and on and on, and they're all housed in this small place in Bohemia. Now, fast forward to May of 1945, and it's now the end of the Second World War, and this is a part of Czechoslovakia that the Soviet Army liberates. And the Soviet Army, I found out, fanned into the town, reached the railway station, and there were 24 railway boxcars. And they broke into them, and all they find is paper. It's these millions of pages of documents of collections and whatever that the Nazis have been storing there, and which the trains could not move west into remaining unoccupied, that is still Nazi-controlled territory before the war ended. Well, they called in the NKVD, the old name for the KGB. A couple of their senior agents just perused a fraction of these millions of pages of boxcar full of paper and informed Stalin. And Comrade Stalin orders that the 24 railway boxcars be transported to Moscow, and that a secret archive will be built to house all this. Mm. And it was. And the building was completed in the immediate post-war years. One of those old-fashioned large stone block buildings with bars on the window. Now, when it was built, it was sort of towards the outskirts of the center of the city. But of course, with the growth of Moscow over the decades in the post-war period, it's practically like in the center of the city. Mm-hmm. My wife, who's Russian, I met her in my travels in the Soviet Union. After we realized, and I'll explain that, where this building was, and we actually went to it, she says, I've even passed this building. It was so nondescript with this little, uninformative plaque on the front door. But anyway, so it was built. It was assigned to be an archive managed by the KGB itself, and that the only people having access to anything there was the KGB and representatives of the Ministry of Soviet Affairs. They arranged Mises's papers, their archivists, into 196 separate files. arranged in the fashion that they thought seemed logical to them. And there it sat throughout the post-war period. Now, did it just collect dust? Well, there was an index that the Soviets had put together. And, like a library book or something, there's like a little thing here where people, sign in or sign out when they've used something. And periodically, somebody in the KGB staff would go through it and obviously peruse it for something, and then and then sign it back in, to be filed away again. So it was referred to, not frequently, but irregularly on several occasions in that post-war period. Though, of course, just the sign-in and sign-out dates tell you nothing about why, in a particular instance, it was done. But anyway, again, I'm talking too much, and I apologize.
No. This is fascinating.
I was in Vienna in 1993, my wife and I was doing research on Mises and Hayek and other Austrians in the official Austrian and Vienna archives. I got a copy of Mises's military jacket, the file. Yeah. I got an immense amount of papers and paraphernalia from the archives of the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research, which is now called the Austrian Institute for Economic Research, and things about the ennoblement of his great-great-grandfather. I have a copy of the autobiography that his great-great-grandfather had to write as part of applying for this. Anyway, so there was someone who I had known previously named Günter Kalupik, who was at that time with the Austrian Ministry of Labor or something like that.
He wrote a really good paper many years ago on the calculation debate.
Yes.
Yeah, that's in Hope.
Yeah, and so Günter Kalupik told me that, not too long ago, I ran into a couple of German researchers, and they had been in Moscow looking for information about pre-war anti-fascist Germans. And in one of the indexes, they saw a reference to Mises, but since he was Austrian and not German, they neither had the particular focused interest nor the time to pursue it. And he said, that's all I know. Well, my wife coming from Moscow, and it was during the Yeltsin years, so some of her friends were actually connected with Yeltsin's government. They all tried to look and find out, couldn't find out anything. Fast forward to 1996. My wife and I are in Washington, D.C. I was giving some lectures for Young America's Foundation. And for a variety of reasons, we decided to go to the Holocaust Museum. And we're talking to one of the researchers. And I said to him, you know something? There was this Austrian Jew named Ludwig von Mises. And, his papers had been, seized by the Nazis. Is there any chance that, since they have like this catalog, computerized thing about everyone who was a victim of every European Jew who was a victim of the Nazis, is it possible that, you would know if a Gestapo file on Mises had survived the war? I mean, just as an historical curiosity, right? A Gestapo file on Mises. Well, he looked through. If it survived the war, nobody knows that it exists. I said, well, I've heard something about Mises might be in Moscow. And he says, well, we have a researcher here who focuses on Holocaust studies in the former Soviet Union, since the Nazis killed so many Jews in the Soviet territories. Mm-hmm. My wife and I were introduced to him, and he said, something? I just received the index to a collection in a formerly secret archive, and it was in a black spiral binder. On the front, on the title page is the name of the archive, its address, its telephone number, its fax number, the names of the director and vice director, and so on. I start flipping, page after page after page. Then it's all numbered. So number 623 Ludwig Mises. My wife notices something. Now, my wife has her PhD in history and political science from Moscow State University, and for many years she worked in the Soviet Academy of Sciences as a senior researcher. So she knows how the Soviet archival systems work. If something is called a file, it's 5,000 pages or less. If it's above 5,000 pages, it's called a fund. His is called Fund 623. 2023. So it's 5,000 pages and more.
Yeah.
So I get back to Hillsdale College, whereas I was the Ludwig von Mises professor for many years, including those years. And I informed the then president of Hillsdale College, George Roach. George Roach, before he became president of Hillsdale, had been the program director at the Foundation for Economic Education. He had met the very elderly Mises and greatly admired him. He had arranged to purchase Mises's library after his passing. He had gotten endowed a Mises chair. He had a Mises lecture series every year. And so I told George Roach, I said, George, this is what my wife tells me about what's the amount there, but I have no idea, but this would be a find. He immediately got in touch with a couple who were good friends of Hillsdale College. They wrote a very large check, like instantly, to fund a trip for my wife and I to go there. Well, she contacted her friends in Moscow. I could not have done this without my wife, Anna. I have to underline that. If this was successfully pursued, it was due to her good works, because it would have been impossible for me. She contacts her friends in Moscow, and now I have the information where it is. They contact the director, they arrange the visas, the entree into it. And so in October of 1996, we go to Moscow, and we get there, and we spent almost 2 weeks there going through all 196 files and basically arranging for the photocopying of about 10,000 pages of material.
Wow.
And it wasn't cheap, because it's the statute of limitations has now passed, and we basically had to bribe them with about $20,000 of cash and an immense amount of liquid assets. Basically, going to liquor stores that had Western alcoholic beverages and purchasing a huge quantity of French cognac and other things. So, here I am. I'm holding Mises's papers, many of them handwritten.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like from 1921, 1913. I mean, this is like history if you're interested in the Austrian school. Right. So we brought it back to the United States. And shortly after that, Liberty Fund of Indianapolis found out about it and approached Hillsdale College and me with the offer of funding the translation of a large selection of this and asking if I would serve as the editor of the series, overseeing the translations and preparing the volumes.
Right.
I can read German. I can even translate German. It's not my first language, and it's a tiring and tedious work, though I have translated some things into German, as you know, from German. But the fact is, we're talking about an immense amount of material. So I was able to arrange for some people to be the professional translators, including one woman who had known Mises before the war. Her parents were friends of his, who translated a good part of the stuff for Hayek's collected works.
Oh, wow.
And she was delightful to work. She's a fascinating, I don't even know if she's still with us, but she was deaf and dumb. She could not speak or hear, but she did this work. But anyway, and then I arranged for some German, native-born Germans who I knew, who were economists or had had experience with business and economics, to translate them. And then my task was to go through the translation, since I can read German, and to make sure that it was exact, right? No translation is literal, you can't do that, but that it's correct.
Yeah.
And because it's several different translators, to sort of edit it mildly, not content, but that it has a continuity of style that is consistent with, since I've read everything by Mises, the style is consistent with what you would expect from Ludwig von Mises.
So let me so this ends up by being your 3 volumes that
correct,
you do with,
which Liberty Fund publishes as the selected writings of Ludwig von Mises. Now, what I did is I prepared for each of them lengthy introductions in which I explained the historical context, what Mises was doing and what these articles were about, and relevant people. And then through each of the essays, the translated essays or articles, I prepared detailed annotated footnotes
Right.
specifying the event, the person, the place, the context as the person is reading.
Yeah,
That would enable them to understand better what he's referring to.
yeah, these volumes are amazing, and I guess one of the things I wanted to, so Mises wrote a lot in his life, but these particular volumes that you have, they give different looks at Mises.
Yes,
Maybe
they
you
do.
could just comment very briefly on that.
Yes. Now, if you're familiar with the Austrian school and some of Mises's works in particular, what you have a view of Mises as the grand theorist, the armchair theorist who talks about the institutional alternatives of capitalism and socialism, the developer of a theory of money in the business cycle, and so on and so on. The person who writes on the wider issues of methodology of the social sciences. There are some pieces in these volumes that are like that, but the vast majority of them are a different Mises that most of us had not been familiar with. This is Mises as the detailed, everyday policy analyst. It's before the First World War. Why hasn't Austria formally gone on the gold standard as opposed to being on a de facto gold standard? And what would be the pros and the cons? During the war, the issues of fiscal policy, ethnic differences, inflation. But then after the war, through the 20s and the 30s, what do you do as an empire is disintegrating into separate nation states, and you have to turn one empire currency into different national currencies? What do you do that as a hyperinflation is facing the country and the national currency is going to become worthless? How do you substitute private alternatives to the now worthless state money if it reaches that point, right? Let's prepare. Yeah. There were people in the immediate post-World War I period who thought that Austria could not be viable as a separate country and should be integrated into the post-war Republic of Germany. Well, how do you combine two separate national currencies? The same way that, the EU, how did you take the national currencies and make it the euro? He has to write about that. Then he's dealing with foreign exchange controls. He's dealing with a hyperinflation that is getting worse and analyzing why and how and what is to be done about this. The discussions of the end of money in Russia. Then it becomes the period after the Austrian Great Inflation, but now he's dealing with the fiscal matters. For example, we have this bloated bureaucracy at multi-levels of the national Austrian government, and then the different state governments of the provinces within Austria. How do you streamline the bureaucracy? And in a public choice way, how do you prevent the resistance of all the public servants? Mm-hmm. So to create enough of a carrot incentive for the older servants to support it, and the younger ones who are going to be let go first will be let go, but you'll have enough of the older civil servants that they'll go along with the the reforms that are going to reduce the number of bureaucrats in the society. So he deals with all of these matters. Yeah. Then the Great Depression comes. Okay. What happens when the financial crisis occurs, and Austria can't pay its debts, and how do you handle cutting finances? And now a deflation is occurring, and how must you respond to that to minimize the damage of the deflation? Mm-hmm. These are all the type of specific policy issues, and it's not only published articles, but included in these volumes are obviously previously unpublished, his internal policy memoranda for the Vienna Chamber of Commerce. Yeah. So this is like the inside stuff that he's telling the people that he's representing, and those to whom he's responsible. This is what we should be advocating, because these are the things that need to be done to save Austria in these different crisis times. So a way of thinking about this is this. If you've read a little bit about Austrian economics in this broader sense, you've either thought, or maybe someone has said to you, this Austrian economics, yeah, that's fine. But how do you apply this stuff to the real world? Right. Well, here is one of the most prominent Austrian economists of the 20th century applying his Austrian economics to these myriad of policy issues of everyday decision making in his time. So in a sense, that gives an entire, Mises as the applied economist of his grand ideas.
Yeah.
And it enriches both not only an understanding of him, but an appreciation of the meaning and application of the theory.
Yeah, no, it's a great. There was a dissertation published when I was a graduate student about Mises called "The Economists of the Country."
Yes.
And we used to kid around when we were in graduate school, about that. But in reading those volumes, it becomes clear that actually that is a very apt description of what Mises was up to at the time.
I should say this, is that apropos to this, what is Mises's place? You're asking Bombavert's prominence in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and in the international circles before the First World War, because of his theoretical books and his significance as a policy analyst in Vienna. His reputation in the period between the wars, if I can make that analogy, if anyone interested in public policy issues over a good part of the post-World War II period in the United States would have heard of Milton Friedman, one of the most prominent and articulate advocates of free market policy matters in the United States, and a contributor to economic theory within his own profession. Right? That was literally the brand name recognition, the name recognition and the significance of Ludwig von Mises in the Europe of the 1920s and 30s, far beyond his own little German-speaking world. He participated. You read things by other liberals and non-liberals during that period, and whether they're agreeing with him totally or partially, or whether severely criticizing him, he's always the foil. He's sort of a benchmark on all these things. So he to use that sort of imagery, he was the Milton Friedman of interwar Europe.
Yeah, no, that's a great summary. These volumes that you did are just tremendous work, Richard, and you and Anna should be very much celebrated for discovering those archives and bringing them out. Just to end with a note of levity about this, I was wondering if you might tell us a little bit about the Batman comic that's associated with this, and then we'll wrap this up.
Okay, there is there have been things called the Batman comic book, and I've never met the fellow, but what I was told, one of their artists, who doodled the cartoons, was or is a libertarian, and he found out about this, and he asked the editors, could he do an issue on it? And so this is it's Batman saving Mises's lost papers from the evil Gestapo, and it's absolutely fascinating. I'm sure that somewhere on the internet you can sort of download a PDF of this, but it's absolutely hilarious. It's really very well done. So
one last question then: do you and Anna hand out candy on Halloween dressed as Batman and Batgirl?
I'm going to mention that to her. Meant to her about that. Oh, and I'll just tell one other little story that about Mises in the old days. He graduated from the university, but before he began working at the Chamber of Commerce, he was working as a law clerk in a law office in Vienna. And so, according to the story, he was told to report and give testimony at a case in a Vienna court, and he showed up late. And when he took the stand, the judge says, Dr. Mises, you were late for court today. Why? And he said, well, Your Honor, I'm sorry, but I had gotten a taxi and we got caught in traffic, meaning the new motorized taxis. The judge looked at him and said, Dr. Mises, there's a lesson in this. Next time, ride a horse.
All right. Thank you very much, Richard.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.